So you said the introduction.
Right. This is the introductory page right here.
Okay.
All right. So here's what I want to say, and I want to give, credit where credit is due. Again, I've been studying the Medu now, going on 2.5 years. I've been very silent about it during that time period, but the more that I've progressed in learning the language, the more audible I became because one thing about people who speak multiple languages, um, especially languages that have relatability or related, it's easier to learn a foreign language when you already speak a foreign language or a number of foreign languages, especially when said foreign language shares almost the exact same grammar and syntax. And I'll give you a brief introduction of what I mean by that. I've heard a brother that I respect dearly by the name of 𝊹𝑓udiji speak on the origin of the Kemetic script and the Kemetic tongue, or i.e., the Kemetic language. And of course, he tells you that it comes from the south. I've also heard 𝊹😪𓂧𓅱 as well as 𝓊𝑃��, both from the Amun-Ra squad, speak of the same thing, that the Medu comes from the south. And today they compare it to the languages in the Congo, such as Chikan, um, Bantu, etc., etc. And when I sat down and I listened to them, being a person that understands linguistics and etymology and syntax and how it works, there were some questions or some red flags that I had for a lot of their reasoning for why they believe that the language of Kemet is a is related or coming from these languages, or whether or not these languages come from it. And the red flags appeared simply because I didn't find too many instances of them looking at grammatic and syntactical relationship between the two languages. Many of the demonstrations that Sanjeti and Asar Imhotep does in order to show the connection between the languages in the Congo, namely Bantu and Kemet, is that they look at vocabulary words and they go through the etymology of these vocabulary words. So here's the first thing that I want to say. When you have two nations of people that share the same vocabulary words, even if there is a lingual shift and certain phonetics are off. For instance, the letters D and T in linguistics are considered dental letters, meaning that you use your teeth to actually sound them. Uh, so, by virtue or by proxy, this makes these two letters interchangeable. So, for instance, let's take the word daber in Hebrew that begins with a D. The Bantu language might begin it with a T, tabir. Those who understand linguistics would see a connection between the D and the T, especially if both languages are telling you that both words mean to speak. Daber in Hebrew literally means to speak. And let's say, because I'm using this as an example, let's say tabir in Bantu also means to speak. As a linguist, you can see the connection because all they did was a lingual shift. The D became the T, which is pronounced with the same part of the mouth. So again, going back to the idea that I saw a red flag, when two languages share common vocabulary words, it doesn't show relatability as much as it shows interaction. When two groups of people interact, especially constantly, yeah, you're going to see similar vocabulary words. But the way to know and discern from a point of syntax, which is syntax represents the very structure or rules of a language on the seed level. To understand the way the language actually works, when we're talking about its structure, you have to look at the syntax, or i.e., the grammar. The way that we know one language comes from another language is not because the other language shares similar vocabulary words, is because the grammatical structure is perfectly or almost absolutely identical. The one thing that I learned so far in looking at Hebrew and the Medu, and even those before me who looked at Hebrew and the Medu, they will tell you that the grammar and the syntax is completely identical. So we are talking about two languages which one clearly derives from the other. And it is the onus is upon scholars to look at the archaeological record, now knowing that the two show such a strong connection that we can understand that one derives from the other, is to figure out which one came first. But I could tell you now, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that from my studies alone, looking at the grammar and the syntax in Hebrew versus the Medu, one definitely comes from the other. I have to admit that, number one. Number two, Bantu languages do not share grammatic and syntactical relationship with the language of Kemet. They share vocabulary words. So at the most, it shows interaction, which obviously meant that the people in the Congo clearly interacted with people in the Kemet and vice versa. But to say that we know that an offshoot of Kemetic tongue is Bantu language based on similar vocabulary words is etymological suicide in the area of understanding linguistics and syntax when it comes to looking at language. We're talking about a methodology that fails itself from the beginning. A language is not connected because they share vocabulary words. Language is connected because they share grammar and syntax, the very structure. So let's move on to my very first slide. Okay. What we're looking at here is the word Medu Necher, which literally translates as words of God, or some people would say words of divine. But I would just ask anyone to look at the Oxford Dictionary for the word divine, and they will tell you it means of God. So this is the reason why I have some problems with some of the master teachers in the Kemetic community who tell me that they don't want to use the term God because it robs the term nature of its essence, but they're very comfortable using the term divine, when we know that the root of divine literally means of God. So I rather just use the word God and stop playing games and stop hiding behind other words that still mean God, because ultimately you become a pseudo when you are teaching people in that way. If I'm going to substitute a word because I don't like it, then I'm going to substitute it with a totally different meaning and a totally different word. I'm not going to substitute it with a different word that has the same meaning. I think that that's a logical fallacy. So the word Medu Necher literally means words of God. Medu is plural. We have the word, and I'm going to go through it glyph by glyph. The first glyph is Necher, and the second glyph is Med, or MD. Now, the first thing I want to point out is this. Although the word Necher is written first, when you speak it, Medu Necher, you always say Med first. This is called honorific transposition, where although the word is Medu Necher, when it's written, preference is given to the deity or the Necher. Hence why they write Necher first. In writing, this is known as, in Kemetic writing, or in the writing of the Kemeti U, the people of Kemet, this is known as honorific transposition, where we take the divinity and we place it first in writing. Now, the second glyph is a staff, and it has the phonetics of MD. Now, MD, or Medu, literally means words or to speak. Now, the first thing that I had to ask myself as a person who tries to delve deep into language was this. Why is it that the staff is used for speech or to speak words? It took me back to something that I took during college when I was doing an EMT course at John Jay College. A lot of people may or may not know this, who may or may not have children, but anyone who has children know that there's a synchronicity in childhood development when it comes to talking and walking. You know that in the early stages of infant development, two things usually occur at the same time. At the same time that a child begins to walk, that child also begins to talk. Now, in looking at diseases that affect humans, no matter what age you are, a lot of diseases related to walking, people who may have a disease that may stop them from walking, you'll soon notice problems in their speech pattern. This is something that I learned as I began to take patients from point A to point B, and they would give us their chart, and we'd look at the chart, and we'll see somebody that obviously has speech problems or issues with them speaking, and they also have problems walking. So from an early age of me looking at the medical world or the medical profession, I understood from that perspective that there was a connection between walking and speaking. And this is the connection here. And this is why I believe MeduNet is a powerful language, because it shows the science that the people understood. Because remember, we're talking about some of the first instances that we see the MeduNet is 3100 BC. And they're using the walking stick, the staff, and giving it the phonetics MD, and they're defining it as speech. They're relating speech and walking in 3100 BC. Europeans didn't figure this out to the 1800s. This is why I believe that the MeduNet is a powerful language. And the fact that most people have never heard this, and this is your first time hearing it, and it's coming from a Hebrew, should possibly cause you to put a little bit more respect on people who actually approach scholarship in a very serious way. I've listened to literally hundreds of hours of videos of MeduNet teachers speaking of MeduNet, and I have not heard a single one of them break that down. So I want to make that clear, that if we're going to speak on love of culture and love of legacy, then we have to penetrate the culture and penetrate the legacy so deeply that we're able to extrapolate truths that will bring profound teaching to the surface. Moving on to the next glyph, we see a hand. Why do we see a hand? I was in a philosophy class back in 1997, my freshman year in college. And the teacher asked the class that all of us thought we had the answer to. The teacher said, "What's the universal language?" And we all said, "Duh, English." It was at that moment that I knew I was and I hate to say this on your channel, but I knew I was a true asshole. That's number one. Number two, he stopped us and he said, well, number one, English is not the most wide or spoken language spoken in the world. That's number one. Number two, language is not the universal language. The universal language is actually hand gesture and hand movements.
Right.
No matter where you go on the planet Earth, if you see somebody straight their shoulders, shrug their shoulders, that means no or I don't care. If you see somebody take their index finger and put it over their lips, it means shut your damn mouth or be quiet. So language, being universal, is shown through the dexterity of our arms, or our, i.e. our hands. So again, coming back to the people of Kemet and the profound science that they had, they understood that in speaking, we have to also incorporate the hands. And that's going to bring us to the last glyph in this word, which is actually used as a determinative. But underneath the hand, we're looking at a 𝓊𝑃, which has the phonetic value of W or U. And when it comes to grammar and syntax, this is how we get a plural in a word. So the word Medu means words, and that which is pluralizing the word is the 𝓊𝑃, which has the phonetic sound of W or U, which most people in the Kemetic legacy pronounce as a U. Hence why you hear people say Medu Necha as opposed to Medu Necha. And the last glyph in Medu Necha is the human being who is kneeling with his hand towards his mouth. And in the Kemetic legacy, in the Medu Necha, this particular glyph indicates all actions that you could quantify towards the mouth. So it would indicate in some instances a person eating, it would indicate a person speaking, anything related to things that you would actually take your hand and put it towards your mouth. I've encountered in the 𝊹𝑓 because now that I actually can read the language, I'm able to go into the sacred literature of Kemet, which is their 𝊹𝑓, the book of the coming forth by day, and I'm able to see how these glyphs and these determinatives work in the actual literary setting. This gesture or this determinative that we see here is also used to denote pondering or thinking or to be in thought or deep thought. So that's something to consider. You ever see somebody in deep thought just take their index finger and place it on their temple, usually near their pineal gland? We have pictures of Malcolm X doing that. Many of your great thinkers will take their index finger and place it on their temples near the pineal gland. and they don't even know why they're doing it, because there's something going on in our subconscious, that the subconscious reality, or the greatest subconscious reality, is our conscious thought frame of mind. And because our body, in motion, is able to connect with that subconsciousness, our body subconsciously takes us places that we're not even cognizant of. So usually when a person's in deep thought, you'll find their index finger guided towards their pineal gland. So this gesture, again, is bringing the hand towards the mouth, or i.e. the face. And I think that this is extremely profound. Let's move on to the next glyph. But before we do that, if you look at the next part of this particular slide, it has the 𝊹𓌃𓂧𓅱𓀃, and it has 3 staffs. Whenever we see 3 glyphs doubled in the Medu Netta, we're talking about plurality. When you see 2 glyphs double, it's just a doubling, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we're talking about plural. There's a difference between plural and doubling in the Kemetic literature, something that I had to learn. But so when we're looking at 3 staffs here, we know that this is another way of writing Medu Neter. You would simply take the flag, and again, by honorific transposition, you would place the flag before the 3 walking sticks. And let's move on to the next slide. All right. So the next slide that we're looking at is the phonetics behind the glyphs itself. Every single glyph in the Medu Netta has a cognitive thought behind it. Some of them have verbal pronunciations, but not all of them. In fact, there's more glyphs or writing in the Medu Netta that has no phonetics than there are actually glyphs that have phonetics. Many of them just represent what we call today determinatives. In many instances, you find just as much, if not more, determinatives than you actually find glyphs in the language. So I don't want to spend too much time on this particular slide, because I think it's common sense. You can see that the vulture represents the sound A. You can see that the leg represents the sound B. The hand represents the sound D. The viper represents the sound F. And the G is the stool. Now, we could go on and on and on, but this is just here for those who are completely unfamiliar with the language. I put this slide here so that if you encounter some of these glyphs, you're able to now make some of these understandings work for you when it comes to understanding what the word is saying, because you can actually put a phonetic behind the glyph. But I really want to move on to the next slide. Okay, this is the one that I really enjoy, obviously because I'm a Hebrew. I entitled this particular slide, "The Medu Netta with Hebrew Equivalent." Hebrew is one of the languages used in most dictionaries when translating the Medu Netta. This is a fact, bar none. I challenge anyone online or offline that may see this video sometime to find me a respected and or authoritative Kemetic dictionary or Medu Netta dictionary that does not have Hebrew words in it. I'll wait. Why is that? Let me say it again. I want to make this really, really clear. This is a very, very powerful point. Any authoritative Medu Netta dictionary has Hebrew words in it. But let me take it a step further. I haven't encountered a Medu Netta dictionary yet that doesn't have Hebrew words in it. Why is that? I'll tell you why that is. The early scholars that examined, quantified, and looked at the Medu Netta all came to the conclusion that when we talk about grammar and syntax, the Medu Netta has a greater relationship to Eastern languages than it does to languages on the continent of Africa. That is a very controversial statement to make, but I'm still going to make it because, again, anyone who says contrary to the statement that I just made, first is not privy to what I just said. Because any dictionary that you look at that has the Medu Neter, they all have Hebrew words in it or Hebrew equivalents. Why is that? Why don't we see more of the other African languages in Medu Neter dictionaries? Now, because I like to play devil's advocate and I like to be objective, I'll take this stance and I'll say this. It could be quite possible that the reason why we don't see other African languages in Medu Neter dictionaries is because Europeans are afraid to show the connection between the Medu Neter and other African languages. That is highly plausible, right? So let's visit there for a second. The closest languages today that any Kemetic scholar will tell you is related to the Medu Neter is the Bantu and languages of the Congo. All of those languages, the vantage point that is used to show derivation is vocabulary. And as I set forth from the beginning of this PowerPoint, before I even started, languages are not related because they share vocabulary words. At best, that shows interaction. Languages are related because they share grammar and syntax. For instance, as we get into some of my later slides, what you will see is that the grammar that is in the Medu Neter is not only perfectly aligned with the grammar of Hebrew, but because Hebrew grammar is perfectly aligned with Eastern grammar, such as the grammar in Sumer as well as Assyria, we have a problem. We have a problem when the same grammar that is used in Sumer is the same grammar that is used in the Medu Neter, and none of the grammar that is used in the Medu Neter can be found in languages on the continent of Africa. Now you have to explain that. So it sounds cute in these lectures when people talk about, oh, because I like to read some of the comments as I'm teaching. I see a brother wrote in the comments, sources, please. So the first source I'm going to go to is what every Kemetic teacher has a copy of in their library. Even though they admit that Wallace Budge has some errors when it comes to the language, every single Kemetic scholar uses Wallace Budge's book in their early beginnings. So I'm going to go to Wallace Budge's book. In Wallace Budge's book, which I have before me, which is Egyptian Hieroglyphics, Volume 1 and Volume 2. When you open up Volume 1, and I'll give you the exact page since the brother did ask for sources, there's a quotation here that says that Hebrew is the closest language to Medu Neter, and this is based on grammar. I am looking at the introductory page of the Egyptian Hieroglyphic Dictionary, Volume 1. I'm on page LV1. I'm on page 56. I'm in Mr. Crumb's Coptic Dictionary, which is the third paragraph on the page. And it says, and I quote, Hebrew, Syriac, Arabic, and other Semitic words quoted in the entries stand in different relationship to Egyptian, for they merely represent borrowing of words, usually by the Egyptians from the Semites, whilst the true Coptic words are native Egyptians. Now I want to go on, because that point was hitting home the same point I made earlier. When you have vocabulary words that are borrowed, it doesn't show origin or derivation, it shows interaction. There's a person that is named in this dictionary by the name of 𝊹𝑓𝑃. 𝊹𝑓𝑃 writes, and I
Lex, you sounding kind of low right now.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay. I'm on page now 44 of the introduction to the
Zion.
vocabulary dictionary. It says in the second paragraph, and I quote, in a very close written preface, which fills 30 pages, 𝊹𝑓𝑃 discusses the grammar and structure of the Egyptian language, which he treats as though the speech that it is revealed to us by the hieroglyphs, hieratic and demotic texts, belong to the Semitic family of languages. I'm going to say it again. In a very closely written preface, which fills 30 pages, 𝊹𝑒𝑃 discusses the grammar and structure of the ancient Egyptian language, which he treats as though the speech that is revealed to us by the hieroglyphic, hieratic, and demotic texts belong to the Semitic family of languages. And to him, Egyptian, Coptic, and Hebrew are substantially forms of one and the same language. And right below that chapter, they show all of the Hebrew letters with the Medu equivalents. I just wanted to make that point clear. That in the early stages of, I'm going to use the misnomer in this instance, of hieroglyphic decipherment, in the last stages of it, it was concluded that the Medu was more closely related to Semitic languages than it was related to languages on the continent of Africa. In fact, there is a Kemetic group known as the 𝊹𝑃₧𓅱𓀧𓅱 family who has a YouTube channel, who has done a YouTube video on the very same thing I'm discussing at this moment, quoting the very same sources I'm quoting this moment. And mind you, they're not pro-Torah, no pro-Hebrew, they're pro-Kemet, but they're still able to tell the truth. The early scholars of the Medu all agreed that the Medu has a closer relationship to the Semitic languages than any language on the continent of Africa. Because when we look at the relationship of languages and we want to talk about the origin, we look at the grammar and the syntax, not similar vocabulary words. So there's no reason to go into Bantu and say, oh, because they say this word similar to Ankh, that we can clearly see that, there's a relationship. No, that shows interaction. Grammar and syntax shows derivation origin. Next slide. All right. This is a little bit more developed, obviously. We have a little bit more glyphs here. Obviously, in the Kemetic text, in the Kemetic tongue, we have what is known as monoglyphs, which are glyphs that have like one sound. You have bio, and obviously you have trilateral roots. So you have bilateral roots, you have monoliteral roots, you have biliteral roots, and you have trilateral roots. So you have one glyph that represents one sound, and then you may have one glyph that represents two sounds, which is bilateral, and then you may have one glyph that represents three sounds. For instance, the glyph for God is 𝊹𝑔👪, and that is actually three sounds. It is written in the Kemetic tongue with the water symbol, which represents N, the tethered rope, which represents TCH to get that ch sound, and lastly, the mouth, which gives you the R sound, which gives you the oldest and most correct rendering of this glyph, is 𝊹𝑔👪. Now, I know you've heard some priests and teachers in the Kemetic legacy and community who pronounce it as enter. And I want to make this clear. That is a Coptic pronunciation. And the Coptic pronunciation is flawed by Greco-Roman influence. Anyone who studies the Coptic language, you know that they took the Medu and put it in Greek letters, and in many instances began to give it Greek pronunciations. You will never hear 𝊹𝑃₧𓅱📀 speak about 𝑛teru. You will always hear him say 𝊹𝑔👪. You will never hear Dr. 𝓊𝑃₧𓅱𓀧����, who is one of the eldest when it comes to the language, one of the most authoritative when it comes to the languages of Kemet, and she's black, by the way. She taught all the master teachers in the community, by the way. She is a direct student of Sheikh Anta Diop, who she studied with. She also studied with Jacob Carruthers. We're talking about people that are known in the Afrocentric community as powerhouses when it comes to the Medu. And you will never hear her say enter or enteru, like you might hear Brother Jabari say. Brother Jabari will pronounce the glyph for 𝊹𝑔👪 as enter, and he'll pronounce the plural form as enteru, simply because Brother Jabari doesn't understand the language. Because anyone who understands the language knows that glyph is actually 𝊹𝑔👪. And at best, you can come to the Middle Kingdom when you begin to see 𝊹𝑇r, but you will never incorporate or come across enter or enteru. Anyone saying that doesn't speak the Medu. I just want to make that clear. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so obviously I speak Hebrew. So as I'm doing this slide, I'm actually looking at the Hebrew for these sources as well. The word on top, reading from right to left, is 𝊹𓅃𓂧𓅱🐡. 𝊹𓅃 means like pictures or paintings, and milim is the Hebrew word for like dictionary. So this is basically a dictionary of the determinatives, which is what we're looking at in this particular slide. In this particular slide, we're looking at determinatives and not glyphs. We're looking at actual picture writing that represents or determines the idea expressed in phonetics that precede the determinative itself. So, for instance, if I'm writing the word atef or itef, which would be like father, sometimes you'll see the determinative for man there. If I'm writing the word hemet, which is like the word for woman, you'll see the determinative for woman there, as you're seeing now. In the Towards the Middle Kingdom period, you don't find this in the Old Kingdom, but towards the Middle Kingdom period, when the word nature is written, in the Old Kingdom, you used to have a standard with a falcon or eagle on it, representing Heru. And that was the determinative for nature. That, as well as the flagpole or the axe. That was the glyph for, or determinative for nature. As we move towards the Middle Kingdom, you now see a seated nature with a curled, long goatee, and that represents God. And in the Middle Kingdom, it also represents king, because in many instances, the king was seen as the nature in flesh, or the God in flesh, in Kemet. I'm not going to go through all of them, except to say that the scenery that we're looking right now, all of these represent different determinatives in Kemet. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so we're getting close to what I really want to hone in on and focus on, because it's easy to talk about the relatability of language when we're looking at vocabulary words, but a vocabulary word can be pronounced by anybody, unless you're a person that has a problem pronouncing certain letters of the alphabet. Anyone can pronounce vocabulary. But in order to understand the grammar and syntax in language, you have to actually study the tenets and rules, or i.e. structure of that language. So again, you'll find several YouTube lectures of people who claim to know the Medu Neter talking about its relatability to other languages in the continent of Africa, and you rarely, if ever, hear them talking about the grammar. They're always looking at vocabulary words. Me, as a person who knows language, will tell you this is how you know that someone is behaving as a pseudo in their diatribe or in the discussion. Because anyone astute in language is going to break down that language based on grammar. For instance, if I'm talking about Hebrew, I'm going to be talking about verb conjugation. I'm going to be talking about what is known in Hebrew as binyan in singular, or binyanim, which represents the seven ways that Hebrew verbs are conjugated. And you'll understand that I know Hebrew based on the idea that I incorporate this into my teachings. When I speak of the nifal stem, or the hitpal stem, or the pual stem, or the pl stem, then you understand that I know the language. If you hear somebody just saying Hebrew, they could have just heard these words somewhere. But when you hear someone discussing the grammar and syntax, you're now talking to someone who knows the language, and therein lies the difference. So here is the word grammar I want to look at. Grammar represents the structure of language. The singular form of the term nature, the singular form I, you see the determinative is usually the kneeling man with his hands upward, raised upward. It represents I, my, or me. But I'll add this to you for a second. Because, again, I'm now learning, and I'm not a master teacher of the Medu Neter. I will never play myself and do that. I give respect where it's due, and I don't put the cart before the horse. I consider myself a student of the Medu Neter. I believe that because of my level of understanding and study, one day I may be able to be a great teacher of it. But at this moment, I still consider myself a student. I want to make that clear. And because I'm a student of the Medu Neter, I can look at this determinative for I, me, and my, and I can also give you the phonetic equivalent, which in the Kemetic tonnage would be anak. or Enoch, or Anok, or just like Hebrew, Anoki. There's two ways to say I in Hebrew literature. For instance, the Ten Commandments starts off by saying, Anoki Yehovah Eloheka. Eloheka means your God. Anoki means I or I am. And in the Kemetic tongue, in the Kemetic language, in the language of the Kemetiu, the term Inuk or Anuk, I'm giving it the pronunciations that it could be, because just like Hebrew, there is no definitive way to pronounce vowels inside of a word. You have to be familiar with the grammar. You see, the difference between the grip that Hebrews have on Hebrew language versus the grip that most Kemetic teachers has on the Kemetic language is our understanding of the grammar within our language. Because anyone who knows Hebrew knows this. You can read any Hebrew script when you understand the grammar. Because in understanding the grammar, you'll know that the phonetics or the vowels is attached to grammar. So when I say u, I know I'm talking about something that's plural in Hebrew. The same thing exists in the Medu. When you find u or u as a suffix in a word, you're talking about something that is plural. So anyone who understands grammar in a language will understand how to correctly pronounce the language. Saying that to say, I personally don't think that the grammar of the ancient Kemetic language is fully understood, because if the grammar was fully understood, it would also stand to reason that there would be no doubt on how this language is to be pronounced. I think the more that the Medu teachers begin to study the grammar of this language, the easier and more natural the pronunciation will come to be. So let me move on now. The second glyph we find as a grammar marker or grammatic notation or determinative is, you see the cup, which gives you the K sound, and it's used as a suffix at the end of a word. When you find this cup at the end of a word,
Sorry
I see
about
you
that.
switch the slide.
Yes,
That's all right. That's all right, because that's continuing on what I'm saying anyway. When you find a cup as a suffix behind any word in the Medu, it means you or your, and the phonetic equivalent is ka or k. Now, anyone who knows Hebrew, a light just went on in your head, because you say, well, damn, that's the same in Hebrew. Well, guess what? That's what I've been trying to tell you since the beginning of the conversation. The relationship between Hebrew and the Medu is in the grammar, which shows you that there is a strong relationship there, because there's grammatic relationship. Because anyone knows when you want to say you're doing something in the Hebrew language, you take the kaf sufi, and sufit means end, and kaf is a letter that gives us the sound K in Hebrew, one of the letters that gives us the sound K, and you place it as a suffix at the end of a word, and that word becomes you. So, for instance, when we want to say your God, as I enunciated earlier, the word for God is Elohim. But if I want to say your God, I'll say Eloheka. And the ka means you or your. We're watching that right now as you look at this slide in the Kemetic script. You're looking at the cup, which represents the K sound, and when you put it as a suffix at the end of a word, it means you or your. But it doesn't stop there. Let's move on. We're teaching today. The next glyph is the viper, which is laying on its belly. It represents the F and V sound. And when it's used as a suffix in a word, it literally means he, him, his, it, or its. Question: anyone who knows Hebrew knows this, and I'm going to drive this point home firm tonight. In the Hebrew language, what letter is used as a suffix to denote he, him, his, or it? Where my Hebrews at? It's the sixth letter in the Hebrew alphabet, which we pronounce as Wav, W-A-V. But in Yemen, they pronounce it as Vav, V-A-V. Going back to linguistics, as I said earlier, linguistically speaking, words that are pronounced with the same part of the mouth, those letters have interchangeability. So we know from the vantage point of linguistics that the letter V and F are identical in language. This is why the viper that we're looking at on its belly in the Kemetic tongue holds the phonetic value of F as well as V, because they're pronounced with the same part of the mouth. In Hebrew, the letter Vav as a suffix is he, his, its, or it. The same thing we're watching in the Medu. But notice, we're talking about grammar. We haven't even begun to talk about vocabulary yet, because at the end of this presentation, I'm going to show you that there are more than 300 words in the Hebrew language that have identical vocabulary with the Medu. So let's say for a second that we're going to go with the language that has the most vocabulary is the most related. Well, then you're still in a hole, because there is no language with more vocabulary words related outside of Arabic than the Medu. And that's something I'm going to demonstrate. And there's books written on it, by the way, so I'm not speaking for myself. There's many books written on it. The next thing that we're going to look at is the preposition to the right, which is the owl, and it's the M sound. The owl in the Medu represents M, as in Mary, as in Marcus, as in Moray, as in Moshe, as in Moses, as in Messus, as in Mesu, M. Now, it means in, for, during, from, with, or through. Again, I have a question for those who know the Hebrew language. If I say in Hebrew, May Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is how we say Egypt in Hebrew, by the way, or Kemet. If I say May, or if I put a Mem in front of Mitzrayim, my Hebrews, what does that mean? It means from Egypt, or from Kemet. M gives you from as a grammatic marker when you add it as a prefix to a word. Now watch this. In Kemet, the same thing exists. M also denotes from. So while y'all watching all these YouTube videos of people claiming to know the Medu and are showing you plethora of vocabulary words in the Bantu and Congo languages and saying, you see, Medu is not related to any of them Asiatic languages like these crazy Hebrews, namely Zion Lexx, is talking, because we can see all these vocabulary words in the Bantu languages. Well, the first thing I'm going to ask is anyone making these statements, did any of y'all take a certified class in linguistics, number one? Because anybody that took a class in linguistics, etymology, or language on a whole, you know that when we want to show the origin of language, we're not looking at vocabulary words. Let's look at the English language for a second and be on point. How many words in the English language come from other languages? Several. In fact, there's certain letter combinations that come from other languages. For instance, when you take the letters P and H and it becomes the F, that's not English. In English, F is F. P and H make an F comes from Hebrew, which you have to remember. It was what language that birthed the Greek script? The Phoenician. What language did the Phoenicians speak? Hebrew. And in Hebrew, the letter P also gives you the F sound. Hence why Russell Simmons could write P-H-A-T as fat farm. Let's move on to the next slide.
Yes,
I have a
sir.
lot of slides. I don't want to lag it. All right. So this is continuing on the point that I made in the previous slide. This is again looking at the grammar. I'm going to come to the right side of the page where we're looking at the plural form. So the singular form of I is the man kneeling. The plural form is the water symbol, which gives you the N sound, as in Nancy, as in noon, as in night. And it translates as we, us, and our. Again, I'm speaking to those who know Hebrew. Anyone in the chat room who knows Hebrew, chime in for a second, because I don't want to assume that I'm the authority in the room. When we're looking at what's called the 𝊹𝑓 stem, right? There's a couple ways we could pluralize words in the Torah, but let's look at the 𝊹𝑓 stem, 𝊹 with an N, 𝊹𝑓 stem. when we take a N in Hebrew and we put it in a word, doesn't that pluralize the word? For instance, let's go back to the word Elohim. We saw earlier that Elohim means God. But if I want to say your God, I say 𝊹𝑃��, where the K at the end makes it you or your, just like it does in Kemet. Well, now let's look at this word right here, and let's put an N in the word Elohim, and let's make it 𝊹𝑃℧𝑃, our God. All I did was add the letter N, and it became a plural, our God. You could do the same thing in the Medu with the same sound, the same glyph. This is powerful. Now, you're going to have people that's going to be biased as hell and say, 𝊹𝑃₧𓅱𝑓 all they want. But I guarantee you, these are cheerleaders that don't have any proper training in any language outside of English. The person that's giving this presentation tonight is blessed to have the opportunity to study Hebrew at an early stage in life and to now learn the Medu at this stage in life. So I'm able to come to the table and bridge these two languages from the perspective, not of vocabulary, which anyone can do, but from the perspective of grammar, which really shows the relatability of languages. Let's move on to the next slide. Words for family members in the Medu. These are some of the most common names for family members in the Medu. Now I'm just going to briefly just run through certain things to show you my familiarity with the language. So when I want to write father in the Medu, it's 𝑓, which is the reed, which is the green. As you can see, obviously like a plant-like symbol, it represents the reed to the left. And then there's the T, or the bread loaf. And then there's the viper, which gives you the F. That's 𝑓. That's how I would say father. Adjacent to it, to the right of it, is mut. You see the 𝊹𝑔 that represents the M, and then again the bread loaf T, mut gives you mother. Below father is sa, and you have obviously the goose, which gives you sa. Right next to it is the word for daughter, which is sat. Under sun is sen. That glyph that looks like a downward pointing arrow, it gives you the sound SN. And the N sign below it is called a phonetic complement. So although the arrow on its own is a biliteral glyph, meaning that it already has the double sound of S and N, for the purpose of filling up space, because when the Kemetu, the people of Kemet, went to write on the walls, it wasn't simply about telling a story. It was about also the art, the look of what they were writing. The people of Kemet took great pride in writing. And I just want to say, for those who may not know, behind the veil or in the craft, when you write something, you are now getting into the mystical element of a particular field of study. Writing is a very, very profound practice. And for those who know anything about the craft, you know that when you want to solidify something, spiritually or metaphysically, you write it. And you make sure that it fills as much space as possible. So even though the downward pointing arrow has the phonetic equivalent of S and N, they still would add the water symbol below it, which gives you the sound N, simply to fill space. And that gives you the word brother. And then next to it is senet, which gives you the word sister. Next glyph. Now here is where we get deep. I touched on it a little earlier. We're going to go into it now a little bit more deeper. Grammar and syntax shows relationship. Larry shows relationship. Simply look at this list that I compiled. That's my logo in the bottom right, so you know that I compiled it. The left side says Hebrew grammar. The right side says Medu grammar. And obviously the crisscrossing is showing you that the two are equivalent. So the Hebrew letter mem acts as a preposition because it can mean from. The owl, as well as the platform, or some people believe is a cubit, which is to the right of the owl on the Medu side, has the phonetic equivalent of M, and it also denotes from, grammatically speaking. The letter Nun in Hebrew is that which pluralizes personal nouns. So when you take the letter Nun in Hebrew and you incorporate it in Hebrew words, it becomes we, us, or our. When you take the glyph, the water glyph, which has the phonetic equivalent of N, just like the Nun, it also pluralizes personal pronouns to become we, us, our. And going back to what I said in the previous slide, when we want to say I in Hebrew, it's Anoki. If you're speaking the Kemetic tongue, if you don't want to write the determinative for I, which again is that kneeling man with his hands raised, then you could simply enunciate it and it would be Anuki. And all the phonetics are right there before your eyes. Below the Anoki on the Hebrew side is the word Ka, represented with the Hebrew letter Kaf Sufi. And when you put it as a suffix at the end of words, it becomes you. Adjacent to it on the Medu side is the Kuk, which also has the phonetic of Ka, and also becomes you at the end of words in the Medu, again showing grammatic and syntactical relationship, not vocabulary, which expresses interaction. Vav on the Hebrew side as a suffix means he, him, his. On the Medu side, it does the same. Again, what I'm showing the community is that when you want to look at the relationship between languages, while it is good to study vocabulary words in said languages, you must understand from the vantage point of linguistics and etymology, which encompasses the study of languages, and morphology, to get even deeper for a second, right? You have to understand that two languages are said to be related or derived from a common source, or one derives from the other, not because they share vocabulary words, but because they share the same grammatic structure. This is very, very important. So when you want to show me that the Bantu languages are related to the Medu, you have to show me the grammar of the Bantu languages. I'm not sure if people remember the discourse that I had on Sonata TV with Dr. 𝊹📃𓂧𓅱𓀃� when he came on as an African scholar with a heavy focus in Kemet. He said to me during a dialogue on Sonata TV, I called in while he was there live. He said, Zion Lexx, it is my understanding that the Hebrew language is coming from the Medu, and the Bantu languages is the origin of all of the Eastern languages too. And the Bantu language has a stronger relationship. My first response to Dr. 𝊹📃🂧📪, if anyone listened to that dialogue, press the one in the room when you hear me speak the truth. The very first thing I said to Dr. 𝊹📃🂧📪, and at that time in history, I didn't understand the grammar of the Medu as well as I understand it today. But I still understand how grammar works, so that's why I asked this question. I said, Dr. 𝊹📃🂧📪, did you encompass any grammatic or syntactical relationships between Hebrew and Bantu and the Medu? You know what he said? No, I haven't looked at that yet, but that wouldn't be hard. So I said, hold on, let me stop you for a second. So you have a PhD in the field of study of language, is what you told us before you got on. And you're telling me, as a PhD holder in language, with a strong focus again in the Medu, that you realized that Bantu and the language of the Medu was related, and you didn't look at the grammar? So y'all already know, I already knew that he needed to provide proof of where he got this certificate from. Because I'm sure those who would have given him a certificate would have taught him that when you want to assess the relationship between languages, you look at grammar. Several nations share vocabulary words. When we begin to dialogue with new nations with new languages, for instance, in antiquity, let's say, because today most nations have delegates that have already gone out, so we're already familiar with different world languages. But let's look back in antiquity. If I'm going to a foreign people and I don't know their language, obviously I'm going to begin to teach them my vocabulary, and I'm going to also learn their vocabulary. But I'm also going to teach them my syntax and grammar, and they're also going to teach me their syntax and grammar. And guess what? There's going to come a point where they're going to have certain of my vocabulary words incorporated within that language. But that doesn't mean that any of their languages are related. It simply shows what I just said, interaction. When we want to talk about the relatability of languages, we must look at grammar. Next slide. I hope we're learning because I'm definitely teaching.
Well, hold on a second. All right. I don't know why there's a delay.
You ready?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure
You
if
see it?
you. All right. Oh, okay. I see it. That's the correct slide. Okay. So obviously, for those who know, we're looking at the word kemet in the Medu Neter. There is some discussion regarding the first symbol, which is green, I'll first say. There's some discussion regarding the origin of that symbol. Some people believe it's a burnt charcoal. Obviously, the person who styled this particular glyph believed it was the alligator back, which is why it's green. I personally believe that it was the charcoal, the burnt charcoal, because when you take the symbol for KH, which is the burnt charcoal, or here, the alligator back, and you put it next to the owl, it has the definition of hot or even burnt. So I would be more ready to agree that the correct rendering for the name of this particular glyph would definitely be a burnt charcoal as opposed to an alligator skin. So, but nonetheless, this is what we have here. So this is what I work with. So the alligator skin on the left represents the sound KH. The owl represents the sound M. The bread loaf to the right of the owl on the top represents T. And the next sign or symbol is a determinative for village. If anyone remembers my discourse with 𝊹𓃪𓂧𓅱𓀁📪 on Sonnet Couch, which to date now has 110K views, so definitely there have been people that have watched it. You remember that 𝊹𝃪𝓂̓ sat on that couch and told me the word Kemet means black people. I said to Shaka, at that time, I didn't know the Medu Neter, but I knew enough to know this. Before I break down the word Kemet, I first want to introduce a little common sense. The word Kemet can be found in the earliest stages of Pharaonic or Nisut, which is the Medu Neter word for king, civilization or era. So we're talking about even in pre-dynastic, the word Kemet. In the Old Kingdom, when we find the word Kemet, you never, ever say to yourself during the Old Kingdom period, the Greeks are here, the Romans are here. In other words, what European civilization is contemporary with pre-dynastic or Old Kingdom Kemet? I'll wait. Anyone who studies global and world history, let's forget about Afrocentric history for a second, which is the oldest. But let's talk about global and world history for a second, which would include European nations. Anyone who studies global history or world history knows that Europeans didn't get in the scene until about 1000 BC with the city-states that we see in Greece. That is when we begin to see Europeans emerge out of the caves of Europe and begin to get on the world scene and begin to make their mark. So I have a common sense question to ask. Why would the people of Kemet in the Old Kingdom, right in Kemet, call themselves black people? And they're surrounded by other black nations, and all of them are black, but they want to call themselves black people. I have a question. When you name yourself, isn't part of your name that which differentiates you from the person next to you? Part of naming something is that you are differentiating it from that which exists around it. How does the term black differentiate Kemet from a room full of other black nations? I'll wait. Oh, we teaching tonight. So people going around talking about Kemet means black people is pseudo. Because the whole first world, as we say, was black. So what would be the point of calling myself black people as a name for my nation when all the other nations around me are also black? How does that differentiate them from me? I'll wait. You see, we're learning tonight, and we're learning in a way that's called objective study. No subjective romanticism here. We're calling it as it is. And if you notice, I don't need to bash Kemet. I don't do that. That's not my thing. I'm a teacher, and my gift is to be objective with information. I don't need to slander. I don't need to make nobody look bad. I could have all the disagreements in the world with Kemetic ideology and culture without necessarily having to bash the people. Just like I say to people online, we could disagree all day, but I don't got to hate my brother. So I hope people are listening keenly to the way that I'm dealing with the information. Because notice I haven't bashed Kemet, nor do I intend to. I'm a teacher. My feelings are out of this. I'm just bringing the information. So the word Kemet does mean black, but we have to look at the determinative underneath the bread loaf, because this determinative is a determinative for village. We just saw it in the prior slide. In fact, my brother, let's go back a slide. There we go.
Okay.
So look in the second or the middle row. The first one on the top is a glyph for house. And I'll tell you off the back, the phonetic is per. If you add another symbol or another glyph below it, it could be per-ah, which means great house. Per-ah. In the Middle Kingdom, this becomes the name for the Nisut. And in fact, the very first time that we see in any literary inscription in Kemet where a Nisut or a king of Kemet is addressed personally as per-ah is Akhenaten. Akhenaten is the first person addressed as per-ah, the first Nisut, the first king in Kemet who's called per-ah, from whence we get this term pharaoh. And in Hebrew, it would be per-o, pero. That's just food for thought. Underneath that is the determinative for town or village. Now, I want to say this. Let's go back to that word Kemet, my brother. Let's go back to that slide for Kemet. Everybody keep in mind that the determinative for village is the same determinative that we see in the word Kemet, because it's all going to make sense in a second.
Let me know when I get there, bro.
All right. Right there.
Okay.
So this is the word Kemet. Now, I know there's a lot of people online that probably don't know the Medu, so I'm going to also use another way to describe this. The symbol below the half moon with a circle and an X, that's the determinative for village. The first part that we looked at before in green was the burnt charcoal, or some believe the alligator skin. It gives us the phonetics KH. The owl gives us M, and the bread loaf on top gives us T, and that's Kemet. Then we have a determinative, which essentially is telling us how to interpret this word. And this determinative tells us this is a word that is describing a village or a landmass, i.e., Kemet refers to the black land, i.e., black land, we are talking about the irrigated land. Because we know that when a land is very fertile, as we know ancient Kemet was, the land or the topsoil is black. And that is why they said that. The people of Kemet took great pride in their land. One of the names for the land of Kemet is 𝊹𝑌. Ta in the singular is land, Tawi is two. The people of Kemet loved their land because the rich potency of the soil, the topsoil, is what contributed to making Kemet the breadbasket of the world. And you don't get more truthful than that. So let's teach. So for people running around talking about Kemet means the black land, the black people, you're pseudo. Kemet means black people. But let's take it a step further because I'm a student of Medu now. So in the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, there's another determinative that we find underneath the bread loaf, which gives us the sound T. And you won't find this symbol here for village. In Gardener's sign list, you'll find N23 and N36. Both represent irrigation signs. They represent canals. And these are alternative determinatives or alternate determinatives for the word Kemet. So anyone who reads Kemetic literature and comes across the word Kemet, you know that there's different ways that you'll find this word written. And in other ways, you won't find the determinative that you're looking now. You'll find N23 on Alan Gardner's sign list, and you'll find N36, irrigation, canal. Again, alluding to the fact that the word Kemet is talking about a well-fertile land. And that's the black land, not black people. There's a point where common sense has to make sense. Next slide. Okay, so what we're looking at here obviously would be like a sun disk on the left. And it has the phonetic equivalent of R or R. The next is 3 foxtails tied together, and it has the phonetic equivalent because it's a biliteral glyph of MS or mess. Now, I'm not sure why it's said like this because mostly you'll find honorific transposition occurring in names like this, but in this one it's not, because in this one it's actually written just like the way it's pronounced. And Ra is a netra in Kemet, so I'm not sure why honorific transposition doesn't apply here, but I'm sure someone who's more astute can explain that. But the next 2 glyphs after the 3 foxtails, or the M-like glyph in the middle, is 2 folded cloths. And each cloth gives you the sound S. So we're looking at, for those who don't know, Ramses. There's a reason why I'm showing you the Ramses glyph. Let's move to the next slide. Now, here is where we get deeper in the Medu. The chosen concept is not just Abrahamic. The New Kingdom Nisut calls himself 𝊹𝑓𝑃, meaning the chosen of Ra. Why did I place this glyph here? Why do I have this slide here? What do I wish to speak about? I've heard several Afrocentric teachers in the Kemetic community, from teacher to grandmaster teacher, make this same statement. The Abrahamic faith and the Abrahamic traditions are not inclusive of humanity on the whole or other black kingdoms, because they make the people of Israel the chosen of God, and they make Ham, which in the Bible would represent, they say, because we don't say that, but they say African people, that would make us the cursed ones and y'all the chosen ones. That's crazy, as if God got a people. Well, I have a question. Brag of himself as being on many of his monuments. Let's look at the glyph and let's see what it says. To the left on the top, we see a seated figure who, by the way, is the goddess Ma'at, or the 𝊹𝑃 Ma'at, 𝊹𝑃 feminine, Ma'at, the goddess Ma'at. She's holding the wasp symbol, which literally means power and could even denote might or strength. Above her head is the glyph or the symbol for Ra, or the sun. So, just so you know, off the bat, the way to read that is 𝊹𝑃 Ma'at. This is one of the titles of Ramses. Remember, each Nisut came to the throne with 5 names. You have the Heru name, you have the Nesut Biti name, you have the Sarat name, you have the Nebti name, and there's a name of gold that I can't recall at the moment because I'm speaking off the mind, but I gave you 4 off the mind. And this shows you also I'm not reading from a chart. This is all off the mind. If I was reading from a chart, I'd have 5 for you. Below the seated figure, you see again the sun symbol, and you see like a slope, or I would say those of us with the English paradigm in our minds, what looks like a slide. And below that, you see the water symbol again. The slide is a trilateral, and it gives you STP, setep. The N is below it, that's the water sign, and above the setep is the glyph for Ra. So that's setep and Ra. What does setep and Ra mean? It literally means the chosen of Ra, or the chosen of Re. Setepin means to choose or chosen of, and Re means Ra. Ramses called himself 𝓊𝑃𓂧𓅱𓀁�, by the might of Ra, and the goddess Ma'at, as part of his title. And below it, he called himself Setepin Ra. Woo! Why are we playing games? Why do we paint a picture that Hebrews are self-centered, narrow-minded Asiatic people who have this very linear and narrow view of their relationship to the divinity, so as if to superimpose themselves above the nations of the world and everybody else by saying or arrogating to the world that they have a special relationship with God that others don't, hence the term chosen. You see, that's the Abrahamic base, and with this chosen stuff, that doesn't exist in Kemet, yeah? So you didn't think none of us would actually learn the Medu, did you? We need that brother in the room, my brother. When you feel the need, somebody got to come in and say, got him, or type it. Next to it, you find, and then we're going to read it now from right to left and top to bottom. The reason why we know to do that is because the glyphs are facing that direction. I apologize for not explaining that earlier. The way that we know how to read glyphs in Kemet is that, number one, when glyphs are written in linear form, in a column, we start with the top first. And the direction that animals or things in nature are facing, that is the direction that we begin to read from. The direction that they're looking at is the direction we start at. So to the right of 𝓊𝑃�13 one of the titles of Ramses, we find another title of Ramses, which is 𝓊𝑃�13, which we see the read has the I phonetic, or some people say A, hence why you say Amun-Ra. But those who know the Kemetic tongue, we know that it's probably more likely that it's Imun, because there's another glyph that gives you A, which is like the vulture, or even the outstretched hand. But the read doesn't give you an A, it gives you more like an I. So this is actually 𝓊𝑃�13. The glyph next to the read, which is like that rectangular column with, I believe, about 9 poles or staves briefly hanging from it, that gives you the sound MN. It's a bilateral glyph. And below it is N. So that reads Imun, or some people say Amun, but it's Imun. Below it is the glyph for Meri, which means beloved. So Imun-Meri means the beloved of Imun, or the beloved of Amun. This is the title of the person below, whose name is, we see the seated figure of Re, or some people say Ra, as a falcon here, with a sun disk and a cobra on his head. That's Re. Behind him, or to the left of him, is the 3 foxtails, which again is MS as a phonetic, and then the folded cloth for S. So this is Ramses, Imun-Meri Ramses, or Ramses, the beloved of Imun, who's also called Setepin-Ra, the chosen of Ra. Why did I bring this PowerPoint up? We had a lot of people talking about Abraham is called in the Bible the favorites. That's that Abrahamic stuff. Why is Abraham?
You there, Zion?
Yeah, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. It's like,
I'll say it again. I have a question. They say, why is it that Abraham is called in the Bible the beloved of God, loved of God, the friend of God, as if one man could have this relationship with God and others can't? You see, that's that Abrahamic stuff. This is what the Kemetic master teacher say. I have a question. Did you think that none of us was going to ever read the Medu Neter? Because why does Ramses call himself 𝊹𓃃𓅱𝓁, chosen of Ra, which you said was just an Abrahamic concept? Why does Ramses call himself 𝊹𝑌𝓁, which means beloved of Amun? And you say that Abraham being called beloved of God is narrow-minded. You see a pattern here? We call it hypocrisy. Let's move on to the next slide. I hope 𝊹𝑓 is watching. Because the next slide has got to do with it. Now, anybody can type in 𝊹𝑓's name on YouTube and watch him in Kemet,
Yeah, you sound low again, Zion.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, that's good now.
All right. Anybody could type in 𝊹𝑓's name on YouTube and see him reading glyphs and disseminating Kemetic legacy and culture. But you usually find him doing what a lot of the master teachers do, like 𝊹𝓃𓂧𓅱𓀃, attacking Abrahamic faiths. I have a question. Why take away from the great moment of being in Kemet and deciphering your ancestors' truths by speaking down towards others? You see, when I'm great, I only need to talk about that which is great. When something is truly great, there's no need to degrade or down talk others. There's a tendency of Kemetic teachers that when they're deciphering Medu Neter texts or speaking of Kemetic culture, to always piggyback, backshadow, and pick on Abrahamic faiths. Well, that's why people like me are raised up today, here to speak and here to teach, because I'm here to even the slate. I'm here to call a spade and kind of even things out, make it a level playing field. I'm here to expose pseudos and show hypocrisy for what it is. Because I found 𝊹𝑓 talking about how, Kemet had workers and they didn't enslave nobody. Hebrews is crazy, talking about they were slaves in Kemet. We only need to look at Kemet when we talk about Kemet's origins, and Nubia is the mother of Kemet. Can everybody see the Nubians in this particular scenery right here on the walls of Kemet? You don't have to be a Medu Neter scholar, linguist, or etymologist to see that they are bound with ropes around their arms, ankles, and yes, they're on a chain gang with chains connected to their neck. But if that don't make you move, notice that all of them have the feather of Ma'at sticking out their head. Is that how the people of Kemet treated others who practice Ma'at? The ostrich feather in Kemet represents as a symbol Ma'at, which represents truth and justice. Period. Anything else is a synonym. I know people talk about it represents truth, justice, reciprocity. Those are people who are parroting what others say. Because when you know the language, you know that Ma'at comes from Ma'ah, which means to see, ponder, or to think. And it also means justice or right, or to do that which is right. Anything else that they say is a synonym of it, but it's not what Ma'at literally means. Ma'at means to do that which is right, or even to straighten. Hence why one of the symbols of Ma'ah or Ma'at is the cubit, which is that which measures the straightness of a thing, or the uprightness of a thing. In the craft and behind the veil, we know that instruments that represent the straightness of things represents high morality. Hence why you see the Pharaoh's throne also seated upon the symbol of Ma'at, the cubit. But that's another story. So the Nubians, who everyone is saying Kemet gets all of their high culture for, are seen here on a chain gang with ropes around their neck. I gotta ask why.
You there, Zion?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I hear you.
All right. We will never advance as a people when we could sit here and say the white man, the white man, the white man, the white man. Guess what? The white man guilty as hell. But guess what? The first person we gotta look at is each other. period. When a great people fall to a lesser people, and you damn right I just said a lesser people, you can't possibly tell me he was that great that he took you down. If you're truly a great people, you have to realize that he exposed some of your own flaws, your own inherent weaknesses. Saying that to say, when we look at history, we apply the same modality mentally and spiritually. If we're going to look at Kemet, we have to look at it like groups I would have to name in this instance. Team Osiris, shout out to Khonsu. Team Osiris, shout out to Ngozi. These are people who look at the information in Kemet way more objectively than most people you see looking at it, because they tell the whole truth. They tell that, listen, when it comes to Kemet, everything wasn't a cakewalk. Kemet wasn't all Ma'at. Do not forget that there are rules and regulations that were broken in Kemet, and there were capital punishments in Kemet committed by people of Kemetic stock, the Kemeti'u. So as they say in this day and age, Kemet shit definitely was stink at a time too, and we got to call it like it is. Next slide. Here we go. So 𝊹𓃃𓓱𓂧𓅱, standing near the Luxor temple in Kemet, before a group of, I want to say, at least 20 to 30 people, is telling them that the Asiatics coming into Kemet, called the Hyksos, are Europeans. And he's showing them not a picture on the wall in Kemet, but he's showing them some picture he grabbed online of what the people of Kemet painted the Hyksos to be. But what I'm showing you in this glyph is from the Metropolitan Museum of Art here in New York City, and it was taken directly from Kemet. And it shows you how the people of Kemet depicted Asiatics coming into Kemet. And guess what? Look at the complexion of these Asiatics. So if everybody talking about Asiatics is white, and Hebrews claiming to be Afro-Asiatic is basically the modern day African American. I heard a brother in the Kemetic stock tell me, brother, if you call yourself a Afro-Asiatic, what difference is there from calling yourself African American? You damn near saying you African and European, because Asiatics wasn't no black people. I gotta ask that brother a question. Have you ever looked at the way Asiatics painted themselves, or better yet, the way others painted Asiatics? Because even if you don't believe the painting I wish to show you of myself, because you believe I might be lying, I may want to show you six packs where I have none, then it stands to reason you might want to believe an eyewitness, which Kemet is. And here we see that they drew them. Let's take it a step further, because we read the Medu, right? So let's look at the top row for starters. The glyph we see with the legs denotes walking, and it's a determinative for someone coming in. If the legs were faced opposite, it would denote someone leaving, just so you know. And the way that we know the legs are facing in the direction of coming in is because look at the animal, which is the owl, and look at the kneel captive with his hands in fetters or in chains. Look at the direction he's facing. So the direction that he's facing, if you're following me on how to read the Medu, that's the direction we begin reading. So whenever the feet is facing in that direction that we begin reading, that means the feet is facing in a direction where it is denoting someone coming in. So we're talking about, in this scenery, a people coming into Kemet. But let's take it a step further, because we read the Medu. Look at the two water glyphs and the viper. This literally means, and would be an equivalent in Hebrew to the Hebraic term iber or avar, which means to pass by or to come through. Any Medu dictionary will show you that this glyph right here represents coming into a place, a locale. Right behind it, you see the glyph for ah. And below it, with the arm stretch, you see another glyph for ah. They both denote ah. Behind it, to the left of it, is the owl, which represents the letter M again. So far we have A-M, am. Next to that, we have the throw stick. The throw stick is used as a determinative in Kemet to represent foreigners. You find it in the words Nehisi, which is one of the more Aboriginal terms for Nubia or Kush. And after the throw stick, you find a determinative for a captive. Right behind him, which looks like a horseshoe, you see 3 glyphs that look like horseshoes. Each one of them represents the numeral 10. So if there's 3 of them, there's 30. When you count the other strokes, they literally represent ones. And we see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 37. So this glyph literally says there's the people coming in to Kemet, and the glyph is naming them. It's calling them Amu. Amu. Guess what? This is how we say Asiatics in the Kemetic tongue. But let's take it a step further, because there's an occupation so synonymous with Asiatics that it's also the same word for Asiatic. Because if I want to say shepherds in the Kemetic tongue, there's a number of ways to say it, one of which is also Amu. Amu denotes Asiatics as well as shepherds, but more importantly, Asiatic shepherds. Asiatic shepherds coming into Kemet, and right after their name, we see them coming in as what? Captives. I have a question. It's just a question. It's getting hot in here. All these people talking about Asiatics came into Kemet, and we treated them right, and we extended them our fruit and bread basket, and then they took over Kemet, beguiled us, and murdered us. That's not what you painted here. You painted here that the Asiatics came in as captives. That's what this scenery is showing you. This scenery is showing you Asiatics coming into Kemet as captives. This goes against the narrative of all the Afrocentric teachers. And below it is Asiatics functioning in Kemet. But let's take it a step further, because there's a name there. Let's read the name. Look at the crook, Crook, Cook, the crook. That gives you the sound heck in the Kemetic tongue. HK or HQ, heck. To the left of it, what looks like a triangle, you find the Q symbol. That's a Q symbol. And it's called a phonetic complement, because it doesn't really need to be there, because the shepherd's crook already gives you the phonetics HQ or heck. But when it has another symbol with a similar phonetic, it's called a phonetic complement. So together, this is heck. And the determinative there is kas or kashut. So this literally is hekasut or hexut or hyksos. How did the Hyksos come into Kemet? Instead of being subjective and building a narrative that we want to say, let's look at what the people of Kemet say. The people of Kemet have a scenery in Kemet, which shows you Hyksos coming into Kemet. And they're showing you them walking into Kemet, as you can see the determinative for a people walking in. Then it begins to describe these people by the name Amu, which means Asiatics. And then it shows you that these Asiatics are coming in how? On their knees with their hands behind their back in ropes. And it says 37 captives. Is this not an eyewitness to how Asiatics came into Kemet? I'll wait. But let's take it a step further. Below, what does it call these Asiatics? Does it not call them Hyksos? You see, until we actually get immersed in the culture and language of the thing that we're looking at, we're going to always be wrong, or we're going to always be mishandled with misappropriated information by those who intend on feeding us bullshit. Next slide. Because now we're going to break it down a little further. Because I've heard 𝊹𝑌𝓃𓂧𓅱📪. I've heard Ankh from the 𝊹𝑓𝑌𝓃𝓃📱.
Yeah, you sound low again, Zion.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you said you heard SETI and you stop at the Unk from Amaran Squad.
All right. I don't know why Seti and Ankh from the Amun Ra squad always talk about why Hebrews want to be stinking ass dirty shepherds. Everybody know them shepherds were stinking dirty, goddamn goat herders. That's Seti, right? I can't figure out why they would say these things. Now I know the language and I perfectly understand why they say these things. They don't know the language. If they knew the language, they would know how the Kemetic people view Asiatics simply by looking at the word that they named them for Asiatics. Because when we look at the word for Asiatic, which is Amu, we're going to look at the root and show you what Amu actually means. Because it's one thing to name a people, and it's another thing to name them according to an essential characteristic, which is typically what a name is supposed to be. When I name something, just like the word Kemet means black land, I'm calling it that because the land is fertile. So why did Kemet call us Amu? Let's figure this out right here. Asiatics are called Amu. Amu is the word for Asiatics, and there's two ways to write it. As you can see, I showed you the two different ways you can write it in the Medu in the left column, and it literally means Asiatic. But let's look at the root of Amu, which is Am. Am literally means to instruct, to know, to comprehend, as well as to see. Look on the right side. Again, means to know and understand. And what I did was I showed you two different ways that the word is written in the Medu, and they both have the same definition. To know, understand, and perceive, to instruct, to know, and comprehend. The root of Amu is Am. And if you learned anything from what I said earlier, the U sound pluralizes words as a suffix in the Medu. So Amu is a group of people. So Amu, the U, means we're talking about a group, plurality, a group of people, a nation. But the root would obviously be Am. Shepherds and Asiatics are called Amu not because they're dirty and stink, but because of their deep and profound wisdom as nomadic people. We always hear about the biggest pitfall of Asiatics and Hebrews or nomads in a whole is that they had no land. These dirty, stinking shepherds, they didn't even have no lands. They roamed the earth with shepherds, with sheep and goats. Yeah? Let me tell you something about experience and trade. Two things occur when people are traveling the world and trading as they travel. In trade, we trade merchandise and goods as well as ideas. If you stay in a locale and you look around the scenery of that locale and you begin to develop high wisdom like the people of Kemet did based on what they saw in their vicinity, surely they're going to have some profound and deep things to say about what they could see. What about the person that traveled the whole world, saw more, and traded ideas as well as merchandise with everybody they met? What would you say about the intellect of those people? I'm not going to leave it for you to say. I'll tell you what the people of Kemet said. They said that they were instructors, they had knowledge, they had comprehension, they were visionists, the word see, they had knowledge and understanding and perception. That is how the people of Kemet viewed the Amu. Hence why we just saw the glyph for Hyksos was the shepherd's crook, right? What is the symbol or emblem of kingship in Kemet? Is it not a shepherd's crook? I want you to think for a second, people. If the shepherds are so dirty and so stink and so dumb, why is a shepherd's crook the symbol of kingship in Kemet? I'll wait. Next slide. We learning today. Oh, come on, Ak. Ain't no mention of Israel in Kemet. Y'all was never there. Well, I caught a lecture with 𝊹📃𓂧𓅱📀at the Brooklyn Museum. Type in on YouTube 𝊹📃𓂧����📀 Brooklyn Museum or 𝊹📃𓂧���� Museum. Go in the first 10 minutes of it. He's asked a question by one of the people on the tour. He's the tour guide, and he's asked a question by one of the people on the tour. They ask him about the name Israel. Is it mentioned in Kemetic text? And he said, yeah, it's mentioned. It's mentioned in the 𝊹📃𓂧𓅱📀. And he says that it means Isis, Ra, and El. Did you hear me, people? The Grand Master Teacher of the Kemetic Legacy, one of them, 𝊹𝑔🄔📪, said that the name Israel, which appears on the Medu Netta, comes from the words Isis, Ra, and El. Well, we're looking at the glyph right now that 𝊹𝑔🄔📪 is talking about, because this is the glyph that's on the Moneta Stela for Israel. And he says it represents Isis, Ra, and El. Anyone who speaks to Medu Netta right now, do you see Orset? Do you see a throne, which would give you the phonetics AS? Do you see anything of that nature? No, there's no throne. So there's no Isis. Do you see the Kemetic glyph for Ra, the sun? No. The only circle you see is a semicircle, which represents R, but it's the word for mouth, not Ra. Ra is a complete circle, a full circle, not a semicircle. So there's no Isis and there's no Ra here. Does anyone see the word El here? So I have a question. Why does the Grand Master Teacher of the Kemetic Legacy, 𝊹𝑔🄔📪, who actually teaches the Medu Netta, say that this name is Isis, Ra, and El, when there's no Isis, there's no Ra, and there's definitely no El here? But I have an even greater question. The Greeks don't come into Kemet until the 3rd century BCE. Out of the mouth of 𝊹𝑔🄔📪 himself, this designation of Israel is from the Moneta Stela, which, if you didn't know, we're talking about between the 13th and 12th centuries BCE. So that's still 10 centuries before Greeks are coming in. Do you know it's the Greeks that called or set Isis? So this name Israel appears 1,000 years in Kemet before the name Isis is ever used. Because until the Greeks entered Kemet, she's known as Orset, not Isis. So why does the Grand Master Teacher of the Kemetic Legacy, who purports to teach the Medu Netta, tell people that Israel's name means Isis, Ra, and El? I'll tell you why. It's the same thing I told Brother Jabari. Misinformation, not being in the know, and deliberate misappropriation of information is dependent on one thing and one thing only, and that's your ignorance. He can tell you that because he knows you're ignorant of the language. He can tell you that because he's presuming that you're ignorant of the timeline. He can tell you that because he's trying to get over his agenda on you, which is romanticizing Kemet as opposed to doing what a teacher of history does, which is record what is written without adding or injecting one's feelings. Let's move on. This is the word Israel as it is used in the Moneta Stela, and I have a Hebrew diagram here to break it down glyph for glyph. Starting at the far right, we see determinatives for man and woman. Look at the glyph below for Israel. You know we're talking about a people and a nation because you see the glyph for man and woman, and below it you see 3 strokes. Those 3 strokes serve as determinatives for plurality, and coupled with the man and the woman, we're speaking about a nation of a people. The 𝊹𝑔🄔📪 to the far left represents a foreign people. Let's look at the glyph now. The 2 reeds gives you the sound Y or Y, like Yisrael. Because I know a lot of people are used to saying Israel, but those who speak Hebrew know it's Yisrael. Or some people even say Yasharala, but nonetheless they're using the Y. Next to it is the bolt, which represents the S sound. Below it are 2 strokes. Below that is the mouth, which represents the R. So we have Isra. Next to it is 1 reed, which represents the I. So we have Yisri. Follow me. So far we're spelling Yisri. We don't have Isis, we don't have Ra, we don't have El. We have Yisri. The next glyph is the vulture, which is the A. So we have Yisri-A. Then we have R. 𝓊𝑃�, and that's it. So what's the first obvious question? Why does 𝓊𝑃₧𓅱 and even Zion Lexx say that this represents Israel? It just says Yisrael. There's no L. Well, guess what, people, if you didn't already know this? In the Kemetic language of the Medu, you don't get the L sound until you get the Greeks. In the entire Medu, there is no L sound. And, by the way, to add a dagger here, shout out to the Dagger Squad, here's another way to rock and shock and tear down the 𝓊𝑃⧱ crap. When this glyph was written, they weren't even using an L sound, period. Hence why there is no L glyph in here, period. The L glyph would have been the lion, which you only find during the Greco-Roman occupation of Kemet. Because as Alexander the Great comes in and he begins to inscribe his name on the walls of Kemet, there's now a need to write L as in Alexander. Prior to that, there was no L in the entire Kemetic legacy. That's why they just wrote Yisra. So again, I asked 𝓊𝑃⧧, where do you get 𝓊𝑃⧱ when even in the glyph for Israel there is no L? I hope y'all paying attention. Next glyph. To the left, I'm going to read it. It says, is the symbol for 𝓊𝑃⧱ a flag or is it an axe? Which school of thought should we follow and why? The symbol for 𝓊𝑃⧱, it is believed to be by several people in the community, but it was namely championed by a European by the name of 𝓊𝑃⧱, that the correct rendering of the glyph for 𝓊𝑃⧱ is a flag, which is on the left. And he then deduces that the reason why it's a flag is because when you think of a flag, you have to think about the way a flag comes into animation, or i.e. how a flag moves. You have to have wind acting upon it in order for it to move. Or in other words, I have a question. Can anyone see wind? And if you could see wind, I definitely adjure you to go see a doctor. Because ain't nobody in here can see wind. Wind is something that is unseen. And in Kemet is represented by a 𝓊𝑃⧱ called 𝓃, who's usually pictured having an ostrich feather. The way that this was represented by Wallace A. Budge to represent a 𝓊𝑃⧱ as a flag is that the idea of having a flag represent divinity in Kemet is that the forces of creation come into existence by unseen forces. That which acts upon the material world and gives it animation is
Zion, you sound low again, Zion.
my fault. That which acts upon the material world and gives all life animation is immaterial and cannot be seen. And this is the thought championed by Wallace Budge on why he believes the correct rendering of this glyph is a flag. But you have others, and I would want to say in this instance, namely Afrocentric thinkers, who I want to tell you from the jump, I agree with the Afrocentrics on this side more now. And I'm thankful for that, because at one time I thought that Wallace Budge made a very profound point that I would have loved to agree with, but I agree now more so with this point. Afrocentric teachers champion the idea that in the Old Kingdom, when you look at the glyph for 𝓊𝑃⧱, you can literally see that it literally was an axe on there. And here is why I agree with it. I agree with it because I've learned the Medu now. That's number one. And I'm going to bring out something that you haven't heard any teacher in the conscious community who knows the Medu teach so far. And I think it's because many of them are just teaching and not looking at language. But since everyone knows my specialty when it comes to looking at things is looking at language, you're going to see me do something that you don't see them do, which is teach. The reason why I believe it's also an axe, and I'm agreeing with the African teachers, although using a different explanation, is that number one, in the actual dictionaries for 𝓊𝑃⧱, there's an alternate spelling for 𝓊𝑃⧱, which gives you the N in the form of the upper and lower crown of Kemet conjoined together. When you see that upper and lower crown conjoined together, excuse me. When you see the 𝓊𝓃𓓃📪, which is the lower crown, when you see the 𝓊𝓃𝓃 as a glyph in Kemet, which you begin to see in the Middle Kingdom on up to the New Kingdom, it actually has the sound of N. The next glyph is a T, and the next glyph is an R, nectar. An alternate spelling of nectar, when you fully spell it out in the Medu, literally has the word netter or nectar as strength or force. And that is why an axe represents this particular glyph. And the reason why I can agree with that is because I look at languages throughout the world and what they have to say about similar concepts. In Sumer, the word for God is based on two glyphs. One glyph is An for the sky, and the other glyph El is literally an axe. In Hebrew thought, the word for God is El in the singular and Elohim in the plural, and it also means strength or forces or energy. This is why I agree with the axe as being a symbol for nature, because it agrees with the more global and diffuse thought of what divinity represented to mankind in a whole. Unseen forces or an unseen power or strength. Next glyph. Let me, by the way, I don't want to take everybody to sleep.
No, you good, babe. Yeah, you dropping that knowledge, man.
All right. Zion is the seventh letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And ironically, it's the symbol of an axe. Everyone knows that the seventh letter of the English alphabet is the letter G. And it is referred to philosophically as the God letter, because it begins with the letter G, which is the initial letter in the word for God. And a lot of people know that a lot of spiritual occurrences that are attributed to a deity usually occur in sevens, not just in Israel, not just in Sumer, but even in Kemet. So that seven ultimately represents the deity, divinity, or i.e. God. And ironically, the pictographic shape or symbol for the seventh letter of the Hebrew alphabet is also an axe. And I found it to be highly significant to mention at this point in time, just to show you the relatability of these thoughts. Next slide. Now, this is going to get a little deep. The Kemetic mystery system, to be very brief, because I could be very long-winded, but to be very brief, let's look at Asar on the left, which you see the throne on the far left, which will give you As. And you see the eye above the throne, which is ear. So that's Asar, or some people say Usir. And then the determinative for Necher, which is the man with the goatee. That's Asar. Or the Greeks call him Osiris. To the far right is his consort, or his wife, or his mate. And you see the throne, which gives you again Os, or As. Then you have the T, the bread loaf, which gives you T. So you have Oset. And then you have the determinative for woman. So you have Asar on the far left, and you have Oset on the far right. And in the middle, osculating, you see the glyph or symbol for Ma'at. And the first glyph to the far left is what I've been talking about or referencing all night. I told you that the literal meaning of Ma'at is to measure the straightness of a thing, which in the craft or behind the veil represents high morality, or i.e. living by jurisprudence and law. So that glyph literally represents a cubit in Kemet, and it has the phonetic value of M. The next glyph is a sickle, and it also has the phonetic value of M. The glyph under it, the hand outstretched, is again Ah. So far we have Ma'ah. The T glyph, which feminizes this word, makes it Ma'at, and the determinative to the right is a woman seated with the feather of Ma'at in her head. and this is the goddess Ma'at. I have a couple questions, and this is the reason why I'm bringing this up. If you look at videos online of Afrocentric teachers talking about the Kemetic legacy, they will tell you that the greatness of the Abrahamic faiths is that it is based on our faith. But in the rendition and story, or in the myth that they choose to tell it in, it becomes watered down and it loses its intrinsic value. Therefore, we don't need it. The Abrahamic faith basically distorts the truths of Africa, namely Kemet. This is what they all teach you. Then they'll teach you there's no body of Abraham. He never existed, so we don't believe in Moses. There was no Moses because there was no Abraham. We don't have the bodies for Adam. We don't have the bodies for Noah. So none of these guys existed. So all of the things that they contributed that are attributed to them cannot come from them because they never existed. But let me take you to the other side of their double forked tongue. Let me say it again. Now let me take you to the other side of their double forked tongue. Because you've already seen me get 𝓊👃📃, which, by the way, there was genius involved in a lot of things that I did in my debate with 𝓊👃📃. There was moments in time where I purposely touched on points, not to bring about a dagger in a room, but to get him to commit to something being true or false, which he made that mistake of doing several times. For several times, he admitted that 90% of the Kemetic legacy is mythology. Solomon is in the room. I know he was there for that. He was literally next to me. He remembers that. Most of the Kemetic faith and legacy is mythology. 𝓊👃📃 is on record saying that. Mm-hmm. Then they agree that 𝓊𝑃📃 is mythological, meaning he never existed. But guess what? If 𝓊𝑃📃 never existed, I have to ask a question. In the Kemetic legacy, they teach that 𝓊𝑃📃 brought agriculture and writing into Kemet. So I have a question. Why do you teach that Kemetic introduced writing into the world when your own teachings say, by your own words, a mythological character brought it in? Maybe that was too fast for you. Maybe I should slow it down and bring it back again. So I will. Why do Afrocentric teachers teach that Kemetic introduced writing to the civilized world and civilized the world? And at the same token, tell you that 𝓊𝑃📃 brought agriculture and writing into Kemet and law into Kemet and civilized the known world. And will also tell you 𝓊𝑃📃 is mythological. I have a question. Who's full of shit now? It's a rhetorical question because I'm sure you know who that is. It's the person with the double forked tongue. It's the person that we have shown to be hypocritical all night. It is the job of a historian to record what is written and to show the people. It is not your job to inject your feelings in your agenda and twist the story. They cannot tell you who introduced Ma'at into Kemet. They cannot tell you who introduced writing into Kemet. And the only people they can attribute introducing law and writing into Kemet are the same people they will tell you is mythological, but then they still tell you that they introduced writing and law. If that's not a dagger, I don't know what else is. Next slide. I don't want to spend too much time here because I know that the community is seeing the work that I did with 𝓊👃📃 on the 42 Confessions of Ma'at. And I want to complete this PowerPoint. So let's slide on. Let's move on to the next one.
Okay.
The oldest recorded, let me say that, the oldest recorded rendition of the 42 laws of Ma'at can be found in the Papyrus of 𝓊𝑃𝑟𝑃, which is roughly from 1396 BCE to about 1382 or 83 BCE. The Papyrus of 𝓊𝑃𝑟𝑃. This is the oldest recorded mention of the 42 laws of Ma'at, or, to use the words of 𝓊𝑃📃📧, the first rendering. Everyone knows you can't find the 42 laws of Ma'at before the New Kingdom. So 𝓊𝑃📃📧 correctly teaches that the first time you see the 42 laws of Ma'at is in the Papyrus of 𝓊𝑃𝑟𝑃, which is in 1392 BCE. Anyone who knows the Torah knows this. King Solomon says that his temple was built 600 years after the Exodus. Following the timeline, King Solomon being about 940 CE, we know that we're talking about 1446 BCE is the Exodus. Don't take my word on it, because my job is to be objective with information, so I'm going to enjoy you to check it out on your own. Following the record in the Torah, in the book of Kings, the Torah was given in the year 1446 BCE. 𝊹𓃃𓂧𓅱𓀃� correctly teaches that the first record of the 42 laws of Ma'at is in the Papyrus of Meheppri, which is 1392 BCE. By proxy, that would make the Torah at least 70 years older than the Medu rendering of the 42 laws of Ma'at. But don't take my word for it. Go on my YouTube page and watch the video where Dr. Ben explains it all. Dr. Ben says, and I quote him verbatim, the 42 laws of Ma'at are a response to a much older legal code which says, thou shalt not. Following what our history records, because let's just clear something up real quick. Just because we see something on the walls of Kemet don't make it true, but it also don't make it false. But there's a tendency in the community to do, if it's on the walls, it's true. So let's go by that. We know that the Papyrus of Meheppri is 1392 BCE, but let's go by Kemet's logic, because it's recorded as true. Our book records that 600 years after the Exodus, King Solomon built the temple, which would make the Exodus 1446 BCE. The Torah says Moses received the law the same year the Torah was given. So that's 1446 BCE. According to Grandmaster Teacher 𝊹𝃃𓂧����📃, the 42 laws of Ma'at, the first time we see it is in 1392 BCE. That will make the Torah almost 70 years older or prior to the 42 laws of Ma'at. But you don't even have to believe that. Follow the ideology of the greatest master teacher in the Kemetic community, Dr. Ben. He says the 42 laws of Ma'at are negative confessions. They say, I have not. And he said the I have not is based on thou shalt not, a law that was given before. Don't take my word on it. Go on my YouTube channel. Next slide. This is again Papyrus of Meheppri, which 𝊹𝃃𓂧����📃 says is the first rendering of the 42 laws of Ma'at. And if you want to hear 𝊹𝃃�1300 say it, type in 𝊹𝃃�1300 42 laws of Ma'at, and you'll see the video where 𝊹𝃃�1300 says it. It's a 2-minute video. Next slide. This is again a scenery from the 42 laws of Ma'at in the Papyrus of Meheppri. Next slide. Now, y'all already seen the work I did with Jabari on this, so I'm not going to stay here. This is the Papyrus of Ani, the judgment scene. In this scene, we see that Heru is bringing Ani to Asar, so that Ani is coming to Asar through Heru. Next scenery. Next slide. But before he gets there, Heru has to say something and pronounce it before the 42 assessors of Ma'at. He has to pronounce the innocence of Ani, which is why an alternate name of the 42 negative confessions is the 42 declarations of innocence. And this is the part that I read during my debate with Jabari, where I showed you that in this scenery right here, Heru is reading and is saying, and follow me, I asked Jabari specifically, when the 42 laws of Ma'at say, I have not, is it based on something that says, thou shalt not? Because it is just simple common sense that a person says, that if a person says, I have not done something, and this is presented as a legal code, then it stands to reason that in order for me to come before a body...
You sounding low again, brother.
Sorry. It stands to reason that before I come before a body of judges, and say what I have not done, it must be on record that these judges or a judge is on record telling me what I should not do in order for me to come before him and say what I have not done. That makes perfect sense. Jabari tried to act like I was crazy until I played the video of Dr. Ben agreeing with everything I said, which was a checkmate. And if everybody remembers the look on Jabari's face, it was priceless. It's all over the internet. With that being said, in this scenario, I was able to read the Medu Neter on my own without the aid of any teacher in the community. I want to say that for the record, because even Rechi was surprised that this was in here, where Heru is reading, where literally it says that Ani is found innocent according to the words spoken and written by Pa'ut Neteru, the company of the gods. So that means this scenery right here is recording that the laws of Ma'at were written, telling the people what they should not do. And then the people come before and say what they have not done. Hence why Heru is saying in this scenery that according to the law that was written by the company of the gods, Ani, and spoken by the company of the gods, Ani is innocent. The same thing I asked Jabari. I said, is there a written document from whence this is coming from a netter to the people? He said, no. Good thing I could read the Medu Neter. But I could say today, I could be light on Jabari, and I understand why he don't know. He don't read the Medu Neter. Next slide.
Man.
This right here challenges whether or not the 42 laws of Ma'at come from Kemet. If anyone knows or studied the dialogue I had with Jabari, you know that I pressed Jabari on this issue. I said, show me what laws in Kemet we plagiarized, we took. What did Jabari say? You stole number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 8. I said, Jabari, can you read it? He said, sure. The law about killing, the law about slaying. I said, Jabari, can you read it in the Medu Neter? Oh, no, Zion just wants to run the clock. No, I don't want to run the clock, Jabari. I want to do the scholarly thing. I want to read what the people wrote. Jabari, do you read the Medu Neter? No, you do not. That's why, in coming to this particular part of our dialogue and debate, you could not read the Medu Neter of the 42 negative confessions. You simply said we plagiarized 1, 2, 4, 8, 13, but you couldn't tell me. Because in telling me what we plagiarized and reading it, we could have put the two next to each other to see if it was plagiarization or not. But again, I get it. You don't read the Medu Neter. But since I do, let's get it in. So when Jabari says that the Hebrews, thou shalt not kill, comes from the Medu Neter, I have to correct him. The same way I corrected Seti. Do y'all remember that Seti didn't know that there was a difference between murder and kill? Did you know that people spend $40 to come to a Sarah Suit and Seti lecture? And the person giving a lecture, Sarah Suit and Seti, doesn't know that there's a difference between murder and kill. Has anyone ever sat in a courtroom? You know there's court TV. You ever watch court TV online? Do you not know there's a difference between kill and murder? Let me tell you real quick some of the differences. Let's say you out with your best friend and y'all in the woods and y'all chopping down a tree. And the axe head flies off as you're chopping it and it takes your man's head off. Did you murder him or did you kill him? In a court of law, you killed him because the intent is not there to murder him. It was an accident. Therein lies the difference. The Torah speaks of 𝊹𓃃�𓃧𓅱, thou shalt not murder, based on the root 𝊹𓃃, which literally means will or desire. So when the Torah talks about whether or not we are taking life, the Torah includes intent because it is important. Why should a person give the ultimate sacrifice, which is their life, and be given the chair or lose their life, capital punishment, if they kill someone by accident? There's a difference between murder and kill, which the Medu Neter in the 42 negative confessions does not give you. The 42 negative confession says, smam. An smam. An means not, not have I smam, not have I killed, or not have I slain. But as you see in the bottom, there's a notation I wrote, the intent is not clarified. Are we talking about murder? Are we including the intent? What if it was by accident? Should this person not enter, and I'm talking for Kemet now, should this person not enter the field of reeds? Yeah, I do know the Kemetic legacy. Should he not enter the field of reeds? Should he not join Asar and become Asar himself if he killed his brother by accident? That don't make sense. Accidents do definitely happen. So why doesn't a legal code, which is purported in Kemet to come from a divinity, which I would assume would then entail perfection, not include intent? But the Torah does. Next slide. And I'm going to end with the next slide here. This is the equivalent in the Medu of the Hebrew word for God. You see the two reeds give you Y. The twisted flax, or some people say it looks like a DNA symbol, gives you H. The quail chick gives you U. So you have Yahoo. And again, the twisted flax give you H. So you have Yahuwah or Yahweh. And on the bottom is an alternate rendition of it. Next slide, because I want to show relationship now. In the 𝊹𓃃𓓃�𓃪, there's a term that says 𝓊𝑃₃, which literally means I am that I am. But as we saw with the writings of the Papyrus of 𝓊𝑃₧, this is 1392 BCE. I am that I am. The Hebrews have a similar phrase in the book of Exodus chapter 3, verse 15, I am that I am. But that's in 1446 BCE. The first time you see 𝓊𝑃₃ in Kemet is in 1390 BC, because we already established the oldest copy is the Papyrus of 𝓊𝑃₧. So let's move on to the next slide. And as we see right here, it says, and I'll read aloud, and I'll enunciate the words in red, 𝓊𝑹𝑃₧ 𝓊𝑃₧𓅱. And God said to Moses, 𓊹𓃃𓅱, I am that I am. 𝓊𝑹𝑃₧𓅱, and thus shall you say, 𝊹𝑏nei Israel, to the children of Israel, 𝓊𝑹𝑃₧𓅱𝑓, I am has sent me to you. You know, I actually heard a video with 𝊊𝑹𝑃₧𓅱𝑓 talking about even the Hebraic phrase 𝓊𝑃₧���� comes out of Kemet, because in the 𝊃𝑃₧���� we find 𝓊𝑃₧. Why didn't he tell you that's 1390 BC? And why didn't he tell you that 𝓊𝑃₧���� was already on record in 1446 BCE? And with that, I close my presentation. Thank you.
All right. That's awesome, man.